24 hours. That's how long it took Italy to put a 25-year-old Imam on a plane out of the country. No trial, no appeals, just 24 hours after a hidden camera caught what he said. And here's what makes this case different from anything that Italy has done before. The man didn't backpedal. He doubled down. He defended his answers as scientific. Then his own mosques disowned him. Then his own home country's law turned out to forbid exactly what he was preaching. And when the footage hit Italian television, the public didn't just react, it erupted. Living rooms went silent. Phones lit up. Within hours, the whole country was talking about the same thing and demanding the same answer. Then Italy did something it almost never does. It moved, and moved fast. Faster than anyone expected. As a society, this country had decided that some things are a line that doesn't get crossed. What he said and what he didn't know is the part of this story that mainstream coverage skipped. The story starts in Brescia, a city in the industrial north of Italy that most foreigners couldn't find on a map. Inside Italy, Brescia carries a reputation. It's home to one of the largest Muslim communities in the country, and Italian media has long called it the country's Islamic capital. That's not a slur. That's a description of demographics. Generations of migration, mostly from Pakistan, Egypt, and North Africa, have shaped the city's neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools. For most residents, this is unremarkable. Brescia works. People go to their jobs, kids go to school, communities live alongside each other. But Brescia also has another reputation, one that Italian intelligence services have flagged for years. The city has been the focal point of multiple investigations into preachers and centers accused of pushing extremist content under the radar. That isn't generalization, that's a documented pattern in Italian counter-terror reporting. So when an undercover team from Italian broadcaster Deport went looking for footage that would matter, they didn't pick Brescia at random. They went where the story would land hardest. And in early April 2026, they got more than they bargained for. The political climate made the timing combustible. Italy, under Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, in office since October 2022, had spent years building a hardline reputation on immigration and public order. Her government already deported foreign-born clerics for hate speech. The mechanism was already in place. The threshold for using it had already been lowered. What Brescia needed was a trigger, a piece of footage damning enough that no court, no public, no opposition voice could argue against acting. Then, Deport found one. The reporter's name is Francesco Leone. He works for Fiori del Coro, a Deport investigations program that has built its reputation on undercover footage that other Italian media won't touch. His brief was simple: pose as an Italian convert, walk into a few Brescia mosques, and ask the questions that a curious newcomer may ask. He picked two centers: the Minhaj ul Quran Islamic Center Cultural Association and the Al Nur Cultural Association. Both are real, established places of worship in the city. Both have legitimate congregations. Both, on this day, would happen to host the same young preacher. His name was Ali Kashif, 25 years old, a Pakistani national. He had been living in Italy for over 6 years. To anyone who walked into either mosque on a Friday, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be: a young religious teacher leading prayers and giving informal guidance to his community. But what he didn't know was that the young Italian asking him questions was wearing a hidden camera. The exchanges were filmed in stages, some in Italian, some in Urdu, with translation provided through a third party. The conversations weren't ambushes per se. They weren't confrontations. They were calm, almost casual. A young man with questions and an imam offering answers. That's what makes the footage so devastating. No editing trick, no leading question, no surprise gotcha. Just a religious teacher in his own setting, speaking what he believed to be true to someone he believed was a sincere convert. Leone's questions were technical. He asked about marriage, he asked about Islamic legal traditions, he asked about what the Quran says about the age at which a girl is considered an adult. Routine theological questions, the kind that anyone studying Islam may ask. And Kashif, he answered them, in detail, with confidence, and on camera. The pivotal exchange came near the end of the conversations. By then, Leone had built rapport. The imam was relaxed, the interpreter was speaking freely, and the recording was rolling. That is when the question landed. the one that would within days cost the man his right to remain in Europe. According to the Quran, at what age is a girl considered an adult and ready for marriage? Kashif didn't pause. He answered through the interpreter in Urdu with a calm that has since unsettled everyone who has watched the footage. Adulthood, he explained, begins with a girl's first menstrual cycle. That, in his interpretation, is when she becomes eligible for marriage under Islam. And then came the line that detonated. A 9-year-old girl, Kashif said, can be considered an adult from a scientific standpoint. And he repeated it twice. In one of the recorded exchanges captured on Leone's hidden camera, Kashif tells him plainly that even science recognizes a girl as an adult at age 9. He invokes Islamic tradition. He cites the Quran. He frames that the position is not fringe, not personal opinion, but actually as religious teaching. Leone presses further. He asks whether such a girl could marry a much older man, a man in his 30s or 40s. Kashif's answer comes without hesitation. He says, yes, 30 to 40 years old. He frames the marriage as legitimate, provided that the parents consent and the girl has begun menstruating. And then, almost as an aside, he tells the reporter that he himself was married at 16. The footage was captured in 2 locations, the Minhaj al-Quran Center and the Al-Nur Center, both in Brescia. Both centers, several weeks later, would issue public statements trying to distance themselves from his views entirely. But in that moment, on that camera, Kashif wasn't whispering, he was teaching. A 9-year-old, the same age as a 4th grader. A child still learning her multiplication tables. A child who, in any country in modern Europe, is legally and morally untouchable. Described on a hidden camera as scientifically eligible for marriage. To a man 4 decades older than her. This is the segment that aired on Italian national television in early April 2026. This is the footage that, within hours of its broadcast on Fiore del Coro, set off a national reaction unlike anything that Italy had seen in months. Because there was no ambiguity, no disputed translation, no out-of-context defense available. The Imam had said it, and he repeated it, and then defended it as scientific. And now millions of Italians had heard it. The footage had stopped being a story. Now, it was evidence. And once that footage became public, the question was no longer whether something would happen. The question was how fast. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. The episode aired on Rete 4 in early April 2026. Within minutes of going out in the broadcast, Italian social media lit up. Clips spread across X, Facebook, and Italian messaging apps. Hashtags trended. News sites reposted the footage with their own commentary. Television panel shows scrambled to book guests. The footage didn't just shock the religious community, it shocked everyone. Liberal commentators, conservative commentators, secular voices, religious voices. There was no political camp in Italy that defended Kashif's statements. The condemnation was wall-to-wall. Italian Muslim organizations were among the first and loudest to push back. Within days, the Minhaj al-Quran and Al-Nur centers in Brescia issued public statements. Their position was unambiguous. The Quran, they said, neither provides for nor legitimizes marriages with minors. They distanced themselves from Kashif personally and rejected the views that he expressed on camera as not representative of their congregations or of Islam more broadly. That mattered because it meant the framing of "this is just what Muslims teach," a framing some online voices have tried to push, collapsed within 48 hours. The mosques themselves repudiated him. But the political reaction moved even faster than the religious one. By the time the broadcast had finished its first replay cycle, Italian politicians from across the spectrum were calling for action. Government ministers issued statements. Opposition figures echoed them. The pressure on the Brescia authorities to act became overwhelming. In Italian politics, that kind of cross-party consensus is rare. It usually means one of 2 things. Either the matter is too trivial to argue about, or the matter has crossed a line so clearly that disagreement becomes politically suicidal. This was the second. And in Brescia, one man had been watching the broadcast, a man with the legal authority to act, a man who, within hours of the footage going viral, would set in motion a deportation that took less than a day. His name is Paolo Sartori. Paolo Sartori is the police commissioner, the questor of Brescia. His office reviewed the footage from Fiore del Coro the same week that it aired. The legal question that Sartori faced wasn't complicated. Italian law, like the law of every European country, is clear about minors. Any view that endorses marriage to a 9-year-old is, on its face, incompatible with Italian and European child protection standards. The question was which legal tool to use. Sartori reached for one of the most powerful instruments in the Italian state's playbook, Article 4, Paragraph 3 of Italy's Consolidated Law on Immigration. It's a provision that most Italians don't know even exists. It empowers the state to expel any foreign national whose presence is deemed incompatible with public order or national security, without requiring a criminal conviction. The legal classification that it triggers is brutally simple. 2 words: social danger. Once that label is applied, the timeline collapses. There's no trial, there are no appeals through the criminal courts, no extended process. The foreign national becomes administratively removable, and the state can act in days. In this case, just hours. Italian governments have historically been cautious with this tool. You use it too often, and it invites legal challenges, European Court of Human Rights scrutiny, and accusations of bypassing due process. Used too rarely, and it sits useless on the books, while the public watches preachers and extremists operate without consequence. Successive Italian governments had erred toward the cautious end. Meloni's government had not. Sartori's office reviewed the footage. They consulted with the Interior Ministry. They classified Kashif as a social danger to public order under Article 4, Paragraph 3. Then they reviewed his immigration paperwork. And here is where the story tightens. Kashif had been in Italy for over 6 years, but by the time the footage aired, his residency permit had already been formally rejected. His application for renewal had been denied, separately from the broadcast, on grounds that came to light only later. As of April 2026, he no longer had any legal standing to remain in Italy at all. The footage didn't just give Sartori a reason to act. It gave him a clean, fast, legally airtight basis. No residency, public order risk, Article 4, Paragraph 3. The decree was signed within hours of the review. The order was clear. Immediate removal, direct flight, destination, Islamabad, Pakistan. And then the clock started. Across Italy, the public was watching to see whether the system would actually deliver, or whether, as so often happens in the European bureaucracy, the case would dissolve into months of legal wrangling. But what happened next answered that question. But before we get to the part of the story that almost no English language outlet has properly reported, what happens when the Imam's own home country looks at his views? A quick word. If you're following along, hit subscribe. We're doing the kind of digging here that mainstream coverage just skipped. The next part is exactly why. On Friday, April 3rd, 2026, the deportation order was executed. Italian police arrived at the location where Kashif was being held. He was placed under administrative custody. He was driven under police escort from Brescia to Milan's Malpensa International Airport, a route of nearly 90 kilometers, completed without delay. At the airport, no press waited. There was no crowd, no public spectacle. Italian authorities moved him through security and onto a direct commercial flight to Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. By the time the news of his removal hit Italian television, he was already in the air. The whole sequence, from broadcast to boarding, had taken less than 24 hours. Done. The reaction in Italy was immediate. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni publicly backed the deportation, framing the move as evidence of decisive leadership and zero tolerance for views that endanger children. Her Interior Ministry, which had already deported a Bologna-based Imam in October 2024 for pro-Hamas sermons, pointed to Brescia as further proof that Italy's administrative tools were working as intended. The political opposition didn't push back. There was nowhere to push back from. Defending an Imam who had publicly endorsed marriage to a 9-year-old in Italian politics? That's unthinkable. Civil liberties groups raised familiar concerns about administrative deportations and due process. Those concerns are legitimate, but they're also routinely raised in cases like this. But on the substance of Kashif's views, no Italian voice of consequence offered any defense. Within 48 hours, Kashif was in Islamabad and no longer Italy's problem. Within a week, his name was off Italian front pages. Within a month, the story had moved on. But the precedent it set hadn't. Because when European governments are willing to use administrative deportation this fast on this kind of trigger, every foreign-born preacher in Italy now knows the rule has changed. And that is only half the story. The other half is what happens when you look at where Kashif was actually sent. Pakistan, the country that, in the Imam's own framing, supposedly endorsed the religious tradition that he was defending. The country that he invoked when he told Leone that the Quran permits marriage at the onset of puberty. The country that he called home for the first 19 years of his life. Here's the fact that almost no English language coverage of the Brescia case bothered to mention. In May 2025, 11 months before Kashif was put on a plane back to Islamabad, Pakistan's own parliament passed the Islamabad Capital Territory Child Marriage Restraint Act. The bill was introduced in the National Assembly by member of National Assembly Sharmia Faruqi. It was passed unanimously by the Senate and signed into law by Pakistan's president Asif Ali Zardari on May 30th, 2025. The minimum legal age of marriage for both sexes in the Federal Capital Territory of Islamabad? 18. Not 9, not at puberty, not whenever the parents agree, 18. The law also criminalizes facilitating child marriage. Marriage registrars who solemnize a union involving anyone under 18 face up to a year in prison. An adult male who marries a child faces 2 to 3 years. A person who arranges or coerces a child marriage faces up to 7 years. That's not Italian law, not European law. That's Pakistani law, passed in the same federal capital where Kashif was sent back to. And the Islamabad law isn't even the first kind in Pakistan. The province of Sindh has had a similar 18-year minimum marriage law on the books since 2013. That's over a decade. In 2022, Pakistan's own federal Sharia court, a religious court tasked specifically with reviewing whether legislation conflicts with Islamic injunctions, ruled directly on the question. Setting a minimum marriage age at 18, the court found, is not contrary to Islam. Again, not contrary to Islam. Pakistan's religious court, specifically empowered to strike down un-Islamic laws, looked at a child marriage ban and ruled that the ban is fully compatible with Islamic teaching. The decision wasn't contested by mainstream Islamic scholars in Pakistan. It wasn't appealed. It became, in practice, the religious legal benchmark for the entire country. Pakistan isn't an outlier on this. It's part of a regional pattern. Tunisia, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, all Muslim-majority countries, all with legal minimum marriage ages set at 18 for women. Pakistan's own National Commission on the Rights of the Child cited each of those examples in 2025 when defending the new Islamabad law against domestic religious opposition. The argument from Islamic legal scholars in those 4 countries had been settled decades earlier. Minimum marriage age laws are a matter of public welfare, not theology. So when Ali Kashif sat in a Brescia Islamic center and told an undercover reporter that science and Islamic tradition endorsed the marriage of 9-year-olds, he wasn't speaking for Islam. He wasn't speaking for Pakistan. He wasn't even speaking for the Quran. He wasn't speaking for the federal Sharia court. He wasn't speaking for the mosques that he preached at. He was just speaking for himself, and for a fringe interpretation that his own home country had legally rejected 11 months earlier. This is the layer of the story that mattered most, and this is the layer that almost no Western coverage carried. Because acknowledging that Pakistan itself banned child marriage in its capital and that Islamic religious courts uphold the ban complicates the simpler narrative, the one that frames this case as Islam versus the West. It isn't. It's a fringe preacher versus the world, a world that includes his own country, his own religion's jurists, and his own community in Italy, all of whom told him no. And Brescia in April 2026 wasn't an isolated case. 18 months earlier, on October 8th of 2024, Italy's Interior Minister Matteo Piantedosi had signed a different deportation decree. The target was a different Pakistani Imam based in Bologna named Zulfikar Khan. He was 54 years old. He had been living in Italy since 1995, nearly 30 years. Khan had been deported on different grounds. Italian authorities documented that since the autumn of 2023, the period following the October 7 attacks, Khan's sermons had escalated into open praise of Hamas, calling for divine punishment against Western nations that support Israel, and anti-Semitic, anti-Western, homophobic, and anti-feminist rhetoric. The decree from Piantedosi cited a fundamentalist conception of jihad and contacts with figures linked to ultra-radical Islam. The same outcome: administrative removal, no criminal trial, a direct flight back to Pakistan. The pattern's now visible. Italy, under Meloni, is no longer treating extremist preaching as a matter for debate. It's treating it as a security issue, with Article 4, Paragraph 3 as the working tool. The Brescia case extended that pattern. It also broadened the trigger threshold, from explicit pro-terrorism rhetoric to any preaching that endorses serious violations of European child protection laws. The pattern doesn't stop at Italy's border. In the UK, in January 2026, an imam named Ashraf Osmani, 52, was sentenced at Northampton Crown Court for performing a religious marriage ceremony, a nikah, between two 16-year-olds. The ceremony had been performed in November of 2023, after Britain's Marriage and Civil Partnership Minimum Age Act raised the legal age of marriage to 18. Osmani's defense was ignorance of the law. The court accepted his ignorance as a mitigating factor, but held him criminally responsible regardless. He received a 15-week suspension sentence. The case was the first prosecution of its kind under the new British law. The British case involved 16-year-olds, not 9-year-olds, and that factual gap between two cases is quite enormous. But the underlying principle that European child protection law applies regardless of the religious framing of a marriage is now being enforced consistently across multiple European jurisdictions. The era when religious tradition insulated a preacher from secular law, well, that's closing. Italy moved fastest. The UK followed within months. France, Germany, and the Netherlands are all watching. And that brings us back to where we started. 24 hours. That's how long it took Italy to remove Ali Kashif. Not months, not years, but a single day from the moment a hidden camera captured what he said to the moment his plane took off from Malpensa.